The baby wouldn't stop screaming. In the hushed cathedral-like silence of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, the infant's wails cut through $200 whispers and the delicate clink of crystal like a car alarm in a library. Julian Thorne, the billionaire they called the Iceberg, sat perfectly still, watching his son across the table. Sterling's face had gone from pale to crimson, his jaw clenched. His hand trembled as he snapped his fingers at a passing waitress, not to ask for help, but to demand removal. "Get that thing out of here," he hissed, "or I'll have this entire establishment shut down by morning." Julian didn't move, because this wasn't a dinner, it was a test, and his son was failing catastrophically. The child in Julian's arms couldn't have been more than 6 months old, bundled in an expensive wool blanket that probably cost more than most people's rent. The baby's face was red, tiny fists pumping the air, lungs working overtime. Other diners had stopped mid-conversation, forks suspended in air, eyes darting between the Thorne table and their own plates. The gilded table wasn't the kind of place where babies cried. It wasn't the kind of place where anything unplanned happened. Every element was controlled, from the temperature of the room to the exact angle of the silverware. And now, a 6-month-old was tearing that control apart one scream at a time. Sterling leaned forward, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This is embarrassing, Father. You bring me here to discuss the firm's future, and you show up with a screaming brat? What kind of message does that send?" His eyes flicked to the surrounding tables, to the judging stares, to the manager hovering nervously near the kitchen entrance. Julian's expression didn't change. He simply adjusted the baby in his arms, letting the screams continue, watching his son like a scientist observing a rat in a maze. Sterling's lip curled. "It sends the message that you've gone soft, that you've lost your edge." He straightened his $5,000 suit jacket, his Rolex catching the light. "I didn't build my reputation by coddling weakness, and neither did you. So either get that child under control or end this circus so we can talk business like adults." Welcome to my channel. Please do well to support by liking and subscribing and commenting where you are watching from. See you at the end of the video. God bless you. The baby screamed louder, as if responding to Sterling's contempt. A waiter approached cautiously, offering assistance, but Sterling waved him off with the kind of dismissive gesture reserved for insects. The waiter retreated, and Sterling's attention snapped to the manager, a thin man in his 50s whose hands were beginning to shake. "You," Sterling barked, pointing at the manager. "Your staff is incompetent. Either you find someone who can shut that noise up, or I'll make sure this place loses its lease by next quarter. Do you understand me?" The manager nodded frantically, already calculating how much a conflict with the Thornes would cost. Julian Thorne Holdings owned half the commercial real estate in this district. But Julian wasn't thinking about real estate. He was thinking about legacy. About what happens when you build an empire and realize the person meant to inherit it doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as the people he'll control. This dinner wasn't about business. It was about judgment, and the verdict was already forming in Julian's mind like ice crystallizing in still water. But to understand how a crying baby would destroy $1 billion inheritance and elevate a waitress to the throne of American capitalism, we need to stay right here. Because what happened next would change everything. The restaurant was a study in muted elegance. Mahogany paneling that gleamed like dark honey. Soft amber lighting that made everyone look 10 years younger and $20,000 richer. White tablecloths so crisp they could cut paper. The kind of place where conversations happened in undertones and deals were sealed with handshakes worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But right now, all of that carefully constructed sophistication was being drowned out by an infant who didn't care about net worth or social standing. The baby just wanted comfort, and no one in this room seemed to understand that. Julian had chosen this restaurant deliberately. He'd chosen the time, the table, even the specific waiter assigned to their section. Everything was engineered. The baby was a late relative's child, an orphan he'd recently taken in, but that wasn't the point. The point was pressure. The point was seeing what a man did when the polished surface cracked and the real person underneath was forced into the light. Sterling had spent 32 years learning how to perform, how to say the right thing in board meetings, how to smile for cameras, how to project confidence and ruthlessness in equal measure. But performance wasn't character, and Julian needed to know if his son had any character left. 2 waiters emerged from the kitchen, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They approached the table with professional smiles that didn't reach their eyes, offering to take the baby to a quieter area, suggesting perhaps the evening would be better continued another time. Sterling cut them off before they could finish. "We're not leaving," he snapped. "This is a private dinner. You will find a solution, or you will find new employment. Is that clear?" The waiters exchanged glances, nodded, and retreated. The baby kept screaming. and Julian kept watching. The test wasn't about the baby, it never had been. Around them, the other diners were doing their best to pretend nothing was wrong. A couple in their 60s focused intently on their wine, swirling it like the secrets of the universe were hidden in the burgundy depths. A group of businessmen in matching navy suits leaned closer together, voices dropping even lower, as if volume could shield them from the chaos. A woman dripping in diamonds picked at her salad with the mechanical precision of someone who'd long ago forgotten what hunger felt like. They were all complicit in the same unspoken agreement. Ignore the disruption, maintain the illusion, protect the bubble. But the baby didn't care about their bubble, and neither did Julian. Sterling's hand curled into a fist on the white tablecloth. His breathing had gone shallow, the kind of breathing that came before an explosion. "You're testing me," he said suddenly, his voice tight. "That's what this is, isn't it? Some kind of game?" Julian's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Something almost like hope. "And what would you do?" he asked quietly. "If this were a test?" Sterling laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I'd pass it by doing what successful people do. Delegate, remove obstacles, control the variables." He gestured at the baby with barely concealed disgust. "That child is a variable. Variables get managed or eliminated." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Eliminated. Julian felt something inside him go very cold and very still. He'd suspected this about his son. He'd seen the signs over the years, the small cruelties that added up to a portrait of someone fundamentally broken. But hearing it said out loud, hearing his own flesh and blood reduce a human life to a problem that needed eliminating, was different. It was final. The manager reappeared, wringing his hands, his face slick with sweat despite the air conditioning. "Mr. Thorne," he said, addressing Sterling rather than Julian, "I apologize for the disturbance. We're doing everything we can to resolve the situation. Perhaps if we could move you to a private dining room." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "What you can do is fire whoever designed your staffing plan, because clearly no one here is competent enough to handle a simple crisis." The manager flinched like he'd been slapped. Julian watched the exchange with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly vicious primate. Sterling didn't see people. He saw obstacles, assets, liabilities. The manager was a liability now, marked for destruction, and Sterling would follow through on that destruction without a second thought. It was efficient. It was ruthless. And it was exactly the opposite of everything Julian had spent 40 years trying to build. The baby's cries reached a new pitch, a desperate wail that seemed to vibrate through the walls. A woman at a nearby table actually stood up, gathering her purse, her date following suit with the kind of relief people show when escaping a fire. The exodus had begun. If this continued, the restaurant would be empty within 10 minutes. The manager looked like he might cry. Sterling looked like he might commit murder. And Julian looked like a man watching his legacy burn in real time. And then, cutting through the chaos like a quiet storm, a voice spoke. "Excuse me, sir, may I try?" Sterling's head snapped toward the source. A black waitress in a simple uniform stood at the edge of the table, her eyes steady, her hands calm. She couldn't have been more than 26, 27. Her name tag read Naya. There was a smudge of something on her apron, probably from the kitchen, and she looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the kind of tired that came from double shifts and student loans and a future that always seemed just out of reach. But her voice didn't waver. Sterling's lip curled into something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry contempt. "Know your place," he said, each word sharp as a knife. "This is a private matter. You're here to serve food, not to play nursemaid. Now step back before you add unemployment to your evening." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Other diners looked away, and suddenly fascinated by their plates. The manager, watching from across the room, closed his eyes like a man watching a car accident in slow motion. But Naya didn't step back. She looked past Sterling, directly at Julian. "Sir," she said quietly, "if you'd allow me, I think I can help." There was no pleading in her voice, no desperation, just a calm certainty that made Sterling's face flush even darker. Julian studied her for a long moment, this young woman who'd just done the unthinkable in a place like the Gilded Table. She'd bypassed hierarchy, ignored protocol, spoken directly to the man at the top, and she'd done it without apology. Julian shifted the baby toward her. "Please," he said. The single word carried more weight than any speech. Naya took the child gently, her movements practiced and sure, and Sterling made a sound like a tire losing air. "This is absurd," he muttered, but no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Nia as she cradled the baby, her arms forming a secure cradle, her whole body language shifting into something protective and sure. She didn't rush, didn't panic, just held the child close and began to assess, her fingers moving with the kind of confidence that came from experience. The baby's face was bright red, his little body rigid with distress, but Naya's expression remained calm. She glanced down at the expensive wool blanket, then at the restaurant's warm lighting, then back at the baby. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she began to unwrap the blanket with careful, deliberate movements. The wool came away in layers, revealing a onesie underneath that was damp with sweat. The baby had been cooking inside that designer cocoon, overheating in a room that was already warm, wrapped in fabric chosen for its price tag rather than its practicality. It was such a simple thing, such an obvious thing, but no one had bothered to check. They'd all been too busy being embarrassed by the noise, too focused on the disruption, too concerned with their own comfort to consider that maybe the baby was uncomfortable too. Nia loosened the onesie's collar, adjusted the child's position so air could circulate, and began to hum. It wasn't quite a melody, more like a rhythm. A low, steady sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. The kind of sound that transcended language and went straight to the brainstem, to the part of human beings that still remembered being small and scared and in need of comfort. She swayed slightly, a gentle rocking motion, and kept humming. 30 seconds passed. The baby's screams began to soften into whimpers. 45 seconds. The whimpers turned into hiccups. 60 seconds. Silence. The baby's eyes were still open, still wet with tears, but the panic was gone. He stared up at Nia with the kind of trust that only the very young could manage, the kind of trust that said, "You fixed it, you made it better, you're safe." The restaurant had gone completely quiet. Not the forced quiet of people pretending to ignore a scene, but actual stunned silence. Even the kitchen sounds had faded, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Nia looked down at the now calm baby and smiled, a small private smile that wasn't for the audience. She adjusted him one more time, making sure he was comfortable, then looked up at Julian. "He just needed some air," she said simply. The wool was too heavy. Her voice carried no judgment, no accusation, just a statement of fact delivered with the same calm she'd brought to everything else. Julian took his grandnephew back, his hands careful, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, and those two words carried more meaning than most people packed into entire speeches. Naya nodded once, a gesture that was somehow both professional and warm, then turned to walk back to her station. She didn't wait for applause, didn't linger for praise, didn't even glance at Sterling, whose face had gone through several shades of red and purple before settling on something that looked like curdled milk. She just returned to work, picking up her order pad, moving to the next table, as if calming a screaming baby in front of Manhattan's elite was just another Tuesday. But Sterling was staring at her retreating figure with an expression that would have made a weaker person check for exits. His humiliation was complete and public. She'd done in 60 seconds what he couldn't do with all his wealth and power and connections. She'd made him look incompetent. Worse than incompetent, irrelevant, in front of his father, in front of everyone. And Sterling Thorne did not handle irrelevance well. His hand was shaking as he reached for his water glass. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful, and his eyes, when they finally tore away from Nia and landed back on his father, were filled with something dark and calculating. What Nia didn't see, what no one in that room saw except Julian, was the photographer. Seated 3 tables away, holding a camera disguised as a wine menu. Julian had hired him to document everything. Every sneer, every act of compassion, every moment of cruelty. Because Julian Thorne didn't leave billion-dollar decisions to memory. He left them to evidence. And the evidence was about to convict his own son. The photographer's lens had caught Sterling's threat to the manager. It had caught his dismissal of Naya. It had caught the exact moment his face twisted with rage when she'd succeeded where he'd only seen failure. Every frame was time-stamped, high resolution, admissible, undeniable. The dinner continued, but everything had changed. The food arrived, perfectly plated works of art that cost more than Naya made in a week, but Sterling barely touched his. He was too busy watching Naya move through the restaurant, refilling water glasses, taking orders, laughing quietly at something an elderly customer said. She was good at her job. Not just competent, but genuinely good. She remembered preferences without being told, anticipated needs before they were voiced, treated every table with the same attention regardless of how they were dressed or how much they ordered. Sterling watched all of this and felt his hatred crystallize into something cold and sharp and actionable. Julian made small talk about quarterly earnings and market projections, but his mind was elsewhere. He was watching 2 people simultaneously. his son, whose every gesture screamed of wounded pride and brewing revenge, and Naya, who had no idea she'd just become the most important person in a billionaire's calculations. The baby dozed peacefully against Julian's chest, full and comfortable now that someone had actually paid attention to his needs. It was almost poetic, Julian thought. A child who couldn't speak had just delivered the most damning testimony possible, and the jury of one had already reached a verdict. Before we continue, pause for just a second. Have you ever taken someone for granted? Maybe a server, a custodian, someone whose name you never learned? Drop a comment and tell us what happened, because what happens next in this story might make you rethink every interaction you've ever had. When the bill came, Sterling reached for it automatically, a gesture of control, a way to reassert some kind of dominance. But Julian was faster. He paid with a black card that had no limit and no name, just a number that meant something to the few people who understood how real wealth operated. They stood to leave, Julian cradling the sleeping baby, Sterling moving stiffly like a man whose spine had been replaced with rebar. As they walked toward the exit, Sterling's eyes found Naya one more time. She was clearing a table, her back to him, humming that same rhythm she'd used to calm the baby. And Sterling made a decision. She wouldn't just be forgotten. She'd be destroyed. 3 hours later, the restaurant was closing. Nia wiped down her last table, her feet screaming in her shoes, her back aching from carrying trays that seemed to get heavier as the night went on. She'd made decent tips tonight, enough to cover her textbooks for next semester if she was careful. Medical school wasn't cheap, and the scholarship only covered tuition. Everything else, the books, the supplies, the endless fees that seemed to multiply like rabbits, that was on her. She pulled off her apron, stuffed it in her locker, and grabbed her coat. The manager caught her at the door. Nia, his voice was strange. Tight. She turned, exhaustion making everything feel slightly unreal. Yeah? He wouldn't meet her eyes. We need to talk. In my office. Now. Her stomach dropped. She followed him through the kitchen, past the dishwashers shutting down for the night, into the cramped office that smelled like old coffee and stress. He closed the door, sat down. Still wouldn't look at her. There's been an accusation, he said finally. Sterling Thorne claims you stole his watch. A Patek Philippe, worth about $250,000. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? I didn't. I never. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. The manager held up a hand. He's filed a police report. Says it was on the table when you approached. Gone when you left. His security team is reviewing footage. Nia felt the room tilt. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She'd helped a baby, that was all. Just helped a crying baby. I didn't take anything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, the manager said, and for a moment she felt hope. Then he continued. But I can't afford to fight the Thorns. They own our lease. One phone call and we're done. I'm sorry, Naya, you're fired. The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. She stared at him. You're firing me for something I didn't do? He finally met her eyes, and she saw the fear there. The calculation. I'm firing you because I have 30 other employees who need their jobs. I'm sorry, it's not personal. It's business. Nia walked out of the gilded table in a daze. The night air hit her like cold water, waking her up just enough to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Fired, accused of theft, a police report with her name on it. She'd applied to residency programs last month. Background checks were standard. A theft accusation, even without a conviction, could destroy everything she'd worked for. 7 years of school, hundreds of thousands in loans, all of it gone because she'd tried to help. She stood on the corner, traffic rushing past, people hurrying home to lives that didn't include false accusations and shattered dreams. Rain started to fall, light at first, then harder. She didn't have an umbrella, didn't have a job, didn't have any idea what to do next. The rain soaked through her coat, her hair, running down her face and mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. She'd done the right thing. She'd helped when no one else would, and this was her reward. What Naya didn't know, what Sterling didn't know, was that every second of that dinner had been recorded. And the man watching the footage in his penthouse wasn't just a billionaire, he was a judge. And the verdict was already in. 3 days felt like 3 years. Naya barely left her apartment, a studio in Brooklyn that cost too much and offered too little. She'd called lawyers, but none of them wanted to take on the Thorns without a retainer she couldn't afford. She'd called the police station trying to explain, but they'd been polite and unhelpful. The report was filed. The investigation was ongoing. She should get a lawyer. She stared at her phone, at the email from the residency program asking about her background check, and didn't know what to say. The summons came on Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a courier in a suit that probably cost more than her rent. She was required to appear at Thorn Global headquarters at 2 p.m. Required, not requested. She held the heavy paper, her hands shaking, and felt her stomach turn over. This was it. They were going to arrest her, press charges, make an example of her. She thought about running, about disappearing into another city, another life. But where would she go? Her mother was dead. She had no siblings, no family, just debt and dreams that were turning to ash. She took the subway into Manhattan, rode the elevator up 80 floors, and stepped into a world she'd only seen in movies. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Art that probably cost more than her entire education. Silence so complete it felt oppressive. A receptionist who smiled with her mouth but not her eyes directed her to conference room A. Nia walked down a hallway that seemed to stretch forever, her reflection following her in the polished marble, looking small and terrified and completely out of place. She opened the door and stopped. The room was full of people in expensive suits. Lawyers, she realized. A dozen of them, maybe more, all turning to look at her with expressions she couldn't read. And at the head of the table, in a chair that looked like a throne, sat Julian Thorne. He gestured to a seat. "Please, Miss Hayes." "Sit." Her legs moved on autopilot. She sat, waited for the handcuffs, for the accusations, for her life to end officially instead of just practically. Julian studied her with those cold, calculating eyes. "You're probably wondering why you're here," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You probably think you're about to be arrested." Nia nodded, not trusting her voice. He leaned forward slightly. "You're not." "The watch was never stolen. It's currently on my wrist." He raised his arm, and there it was. Platinum and diamonds and worth more than she'd make in a decade. She stared at it, her brain struggling to process what this meant. "The entire dinner was a test," Julian continued. "A character audit. My son was being evaluated. His response to pressure. His treatment of those he considers beneath him. His capacity for empathy." He paused, letting that sink in. He failed spectacularly. One of the lawyers pressed a button, and a screen descended from the ceiling. Footage began to play. Sterling's threats, his contempt, his accusation, all of it captured in high definition from multiple angles. Nia watched herself calm the baby, watched Sterling's face twist with rage, and felt something in her chest crack open. "You're not here because you did something wrong," Julian said quietly. "You're here because you did something right. And in doing so, you revealed exactly who my son is. He's a predator, Miss Hayes, and predators destroy value. You, however, protect it." The lawyers were watching her now with something that looked almost like respect. Nia's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "I don't understand," she whispered. Julian's expression shifted just slightly. Something almost like warmth touched his eyes. "You will," he said, "because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." Julian stood, moving to the windows overlooking Manhattan. "My firm operates under a charter I designed 40 years ago," he said. "It includes what I call a meritocratic clause, a safeguard against the exact kind of corruption my son represents." He turned back to face her. "If any member of the founding family uses the firm's resources or influence to commit a crime, they trigger automatic disinheritance. Legal, immediate, and irreversible." Nia's brain was trying to keep up. "Sterling's false police report used your influence." Julian nodded. He leveraged the Thorne name to fabricate evidence. "He threatened the restaurant's lease, which we own. He attempted to destroy your future to soothe his ego. Under the charter, he just lost everything." The lawyers began distributing documents. Thick stacks of paper with legal language Nia couldn't begin to understand. One of them, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward. "As of this morning, Sterling Thorne has been formally removed from all positions within Thorne Global. His trust fund has been frozen. His shares have been reallocated. He no longer has any claim to the family business." The words were clinical, but Nia heard the weight behind them. A man's entire life dismantled in 72 hours because he'd tried to hurt her. She should have felt vindicated, relieved. Something. Instead, she just felt numb. "This is all happening because of me," she said. Julian shook his head. "This is happening because of him. You were simply the catalyst, the test he failed. If it hadn't been you, It would have been someone else eventually. Better I discovered his true nature now than after I'm gone. He sat back down, and for the first time, Naya noticed how tired he looked. How old? But that's not why you're here, he continued. There's something else you need to know. Something about your mother. The numbness shattered. Her mother had died 2 years ago. Cancer, no insurance, drowning in medical debt that Nia was still paying off. What does she have to do with this? Julian's expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. Everything, Miss Hayes. She has everything to do with this. He slid a folder across the table. DNA results, medical records, old photographs of people she didn't recognize. Your mother's name was Sarah Hayes, Julian said, but before she married your father, before you were born, her name was Sarah Thorne. The room started spinning. Naya grabbed the edge of the table, trying to anchor herself to something solid. That's not possible. My mother never, she wouldn't. Julian held up a hand. 30 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. My daughter fell in love with a man I didn't approve of. He wasn't wealthy, wasn't connected, wasn't part of our world. So I cut her off, told her if she married him, she was no longer my daughter. He paused, and something that might have been grief crossed his face. She married him anyway, and I was too proud, too stubborn to reach out. By the time I tried to find her, she'd passed away. Nia couldn't breathe. Her mother had never mentioned any of this. Never said a word about being a thorn, about being disowned, about having a father who'd abandoned her. We were poor, she whispered. My mother worked 3 jobs. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. She died because she couldn't afford treatment. And you were here the whole time. Julian closed his eyes. Yes, and I will regret that for whatever time I have left. But I can't change the past, Miss Hayes. I can only try to make the future right. Pause the video. Rate this story so far from 0 to 10. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. One of the lawyers placed another document in front of her. This is a DNA test confirming your relationship to Julian Thorne. You are his biological granddaughter, his only living blood relative besides Sterling. Under the Charter and New York inheritance law, you have a legal claim to the Thorne estate. Nia stared at the paper, at the percentages and markers that proved she was related to a man she'd met 3 days ago while waitressing. This isn't real, she said. This is some kind of mistake. Julian leaned forward. It's not a mistake. And it's not guilt money, it's justice. You're the rightful heir, Miss Hayes. The question is, are you strong enough to take it? Nia stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. I don't want your guilt money, she said, her voice shaking. You let my mother die thinking you hated her. You let her work herself into an early grave while you sat in penthouses counting billions. And now you want to hand me an empire because your real son disappointed you. Her hands were fists at her sides. I'm not your redemption, Mr. Thorne. I'm not your do-over. Julian didn't flinch. You're right, he said quietly. I can't undo what I did to Sarah. I can't give you back the childhood you should have had. The mother who should still be alive? He stood, meeting her eyes. But I can make sure that people like Sterling don't keep stepping on people like your mother. Like you. That's what this is about. Not redemption. Justice. Nia felt tears burning her eyes. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain her mother must have felt, abandoned and alone. My mother died without health insurance, she said, her voice breaking. She was 53 years old. Treatable cancer. But she couldn't afford treatment, so she just got sicker and sicker until there was nothing left. I watched her waste away in a hospital bed, apologizing for the bills she was leaving me. And you're telling me she was your daughter? That she had a father who could have saved her with pocket change? Julian's face had gone pale. I didn't know she was sick. I didn't know where she was. I tried to find her, but she'd changed her name when she married. By the time my investigators located her, it was too late. Nia laughed, a bitter sound that hurt her throat. Too late. That's convenient. You had 40 years to find her, Mr. Thorne. 40 years to swallow your pride and reach out. But you didn't. And now she's dead. So forgive me if I don't fall at your feet in gratitude because you're offering me the money you should have given her. One of the lawyers shifted uncomfortably. The others stared at their papers, suddenly fascinated by legal language they'd already memorized. Julian stood very still, taking the verbal blows like a man who knew he deserved them. You think I don't know that? He said finally. You think I haven't spent the last 2 years wishing I could go back? Change it? His voice cracked slightly. I can't. All I can do is try to make sure her death meant something, that her daughter doesn't spend the rest of her life crushed by the same system that killed her. Nia wiped her eyes angrily. And what if I don't want it? What if I don't want anything from you? Julian met her gaze. Then walk away. No one will stop you. But understand what you're walking away from. He gestured to the city beyond the windows. Thorn Global controls $17 billion in assets. We have influence in healthcare, real estate, technology, energy. We shape policy. We fund research. We employ 40,000 people. He turned back to her. In Sterling's hands, that power becomes a weapon. He'll gut worker protections, maximize profit at any cost, turn everything I built into exactly the kind of machine that killed your mother. Is that what you want? Nia stared at him. So I take it to spite him, to get revenge? That's not a reason to run a company. No, Julian said. You take it because you understand something Sterling never will. That power without compassion is just organized cruelty. You take it because when you saw a crying baby, you didn't see an inconvenience. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped, even though it cost you everything. He stepped closer. That's not weakness, Miss Hayes. That's exactly the kind of strength this company needs. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city below. Nia felt something shift inside her. The anger was still there, hot and righteous and justified, but underneath it was something else. A question. What would her mother want? Would she want Nia to walk away and let Sterling's type keep winning? Or would she want her daughter to take the power and use it differently? To be the change that might have saved her if it had existed 30 years ago? She looked at Julian, at this man who'd failed her mother so completely but was trying, in his broken way, to make it right. I'll take your company, she said quietly. Not because you're my grandfather, not because I forgive you, I don't, but because people like Sterling have been stepping on people like my mother for generations. And I'm going to make sure it stops. Julian's shoulders sagged slightly, relief and grief mixing on his face. The lawyers began moving, pulling out more papers, but Nia held up a hand. But I have conditions. Everyone froze. She looked around the room at these people who'd spent their lives serving the Thorns. First, every employee gets health care, real health care, not the minimum required by law. Second, we divest from any holding that profits from human suffering. Private prisons, predatory lending, all of it. Third, we establish a fund for people like my mother. Single parents, medical debt, whatever they need. And it's not charity, it's restitution. She met Julian's eyes. Those are my terms. Take them or I walk. For the first time since she'd entered the room, Julian Thorne smiled. It was a small smile, sad around the edges, but genuine. Your mother would be proud, he said softly. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Miss Hayes, if you're ready, we can begin the transition process. Nia took a deep breath. The enormity of what she was agreeing to was starting to sink in. She was 26 years old. She'd been a waitress 3 days ago, and now she was about to become the head of a multi-billion-dollar empire. It was insane. It was impossible. It was terrifying. But somewhere in her chest, underneath the fear and anger and grief, was something else. Something that felt almost like purpose. I'm ready, she said. And in a conference room 80 floors above Manhattan, with a dozen lawyers as witnesses and a grandfather she'd just met, Nia Hayes became the heir to everything Sterling Thorne thought was his. 1 week later, the press conference was chaos. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted questions over each other. Security struggled to maintain order as the crowd pressed against the barriers. The lobby of Thorn Global had been transformed into a media circus, and at the center of it all, looking calm in a way she absolutely didn't feel, stood Nia Hayes. She wore a suit Julian's people had picked out, something that cost more than her old monthly rent. Her hair was styled. Her makeup was perfect. She looked like she belonged. She felt like an imposter. Julian stood beside her at the podium, his hand steady on her shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice cutting through the noise. Today marks a new chapter for Thorn Global. Effective immediately, Miss Nia Hayes will assume the role of chairwoman of the board. The room exploded. Questions flew like bullets. Who is she? Where did she come from? What about Sterling Thorne? Julian raised his hand for silence. Miss Hayes is my granddaughter. Recently discovered after a long family separation. She has demonstrated the character and vision this company needs to move forward. In the back of the room, barely visible through the crowd, Sterling stood watching. His face was pale. His suit, usually impeccable, looked slept in. He'd lost 15 pounds in a week, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to process what was happening to him. Everything he'd built his identity around was gone. The money, the power, the Thorn name that opened every door. All of it stripped away because he'd tried to destroy a waitress who'd made him look bad. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't destroying him. He tried to push forward, to contest, to say something. Anything that would stop this nightmare. But security blocked his path. He wasn't on the list anymore. Wasn't authorized. He was just another face in the crowd now, invisible and irrelevant. A reporter recognized him, shoved a microphone in his face. "Mr. Thorn, how do you feel about being replaced?" Sterling's mouth opened, but no words came. How did he feel? Betrayed. Humiliated. Erased. Like his entire existence had been a test he didn't know he was taking until he'd already failed. Julian's voice continued from the podium. My son had every advantage, every opportunity, but he forgot the only rule that matters. Character is capital. Without it, everything else is just numbers on a screen, and numbers can disappear overnight. Sterling watched his father say these words, watched him hand over everything to a woman Sterling had tried to destroy, and felt something inside him break. Not his pride. That was already gone. Something deeper. The belief that he mattered, that he was special, that being a Thorn meant something. He turned and pushed through the crowd, ignoring the reporters, the cameras, the shouted questions. He made it outside into the cold air and just stood there, breathing hard, feeling like he was drowning. His phone buzzed. Another creditor. Another former friend who'd heard the news and wanted to distance themselves. Another door closing. He looked up at the Thorn Global building, at the name that was his birthright, and realized it wasn't his anymore. It never really had been. He'd just been borrowing it. And now the bill had come due. At the podium, Nia stepped forward. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. I know many of you are surprised by this announcement, she said. I was too. But I'm here because I believe that power should serve people, not the other way around. That success without humanity is just expensive emptiness. She looked directly into the cameras. Thorn Global will be different now. Better. And if you're watching, if you're someone who's been stepped on, ignored, dismissed because you don't have the right name or the right connections, know this. Things are changing. And you matter. What would you do if you suddenly inherited a billion-dollar company? Comment below. We want to know. 6 months later, Nia sat in a diner at 2 in the morning, her medical textbooks spread across the table, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. She'd just finished her last exam. If she passed, and she was pretty sure she had, she'd be Dr. Hayes in 3 months. Running a multi-billion-dollar company and finishing medical school simultaneously had nearly killed her. But she'd done it. Refused to let either dream die just because circumstances had changed. The waitress refilling coffee pots looked exhausted in the way Nia remembered being exhausted 6 months ago. At the booth behind her, a baby started crying. Nia glanced over. A young mother, maybe 22, was trying to calm the infant while simultaneously keeping her toddler from coloring on the seats. She looked overwhelmed, defeated, the kind of tired that came from being alone and broke and running on nothing but willpower. Other customers were starting to stare, to whisper. The manager was walking over with that apologetic but firm expression Nia recognized, the one that meant, you're disturbing people, you need to leave. Nia stood before she'd consciously decided to move. Excuse me, she said to the manager. I've got this. She walked to the booth, slid in across from the mother. Hi, mind if I try? The woman looked at her with desperate, grateful eyes and nodded. Nia took the baby gently, checked for the obvious problems. Diaper was fine. Bottle was full. But the onesie had a tag that was probably scratching, and the booth's vinyl was probably too cold against the baby's legs. She adjusted both, hummed that same rhythm she'd used in the gilded table, and within a minute the crying stopped. The mother started crying instead. Thank you, she whispered. No one ever just helps. Everyone just stares like I'm doing it wrong. Nia handed the baby back. You're not doing anything wrong. Babies are just hard sometimes. She gestured to the waitress who'd been watching. Can you bring her order? Whatever she wants. On me. The woman protested, but Nia shook her head. Please, let me. The waitress took the order and walked away. The manager who'd been hovering suddenly recognized Nia. Wait, you're Nia Hayes. You run Thorn Global. Nia smiled. I am. But tonight, I'm just someone who remembers what it's like. After the mother and her kids left, full and happy and with $100 bill, Nia had slipped into the diaper bag when she wasn't looking. Nia paid for her coffee and headed out. The city was quiet at this hour. Peaceful. She drove to a cemetery in Queens, parked, and walked through rows of headstones until she found her mother's. She sat down on the grass, not caring about the dew soaking through her jeans. "You were right about everything," she said to the marble stone. "About working hard. About helping people. About character mattering more than money." She traced her mother's name with her finger. "I met him. Your father. He's dying. Cancer, same as you. The universe has a sick sense of humor." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind in the trees. "He's not a good man, Mom, but he's trying, and I think that has to count for something." She'd established the Sarah Hayes Memorial Fund 3 months ago. Full scholarships for single parents pursuing any degree. Healthcare coverage included, childcare stipend, everything her mother had needed and never had. "I'm changing things," Nia continued, slowly. "But it's happening. We divested from private prisons last month, doubled our parental leave, started a program to hire people with records, give them second chances. Sterling would have hated all of it." She smiled slightly. "Which is how I know we're doing it right." She stood, brushed the grass from her pants. Tomorrow she'd present to the board. Next week she'd take her medical boards. But tonight she was just a granddaughter saying goodbye and thank you to a mother who'd taught her everything that mattered. Julian had died 2 weeks ago, peaceful in his sleep, with Nia holding his hand. He'd left her everything, but more importantly, he'd left her a choice. What kind of legacy to build? What kind of power to wield? And Nia had chosen to use it the way her mother would have. Not for revenge or profit, but for the people who needed it most. She walked back to her car. The city was waking up around her. Another day, another chance to do better. And as the sun broke over the skyline, Nia Hayes, former waitress, current billionaire, future doctor, drove toward whatever came next. She thought about Sterling sometimes. She'd heard through channels that he was working as a consultant now. Mid-level, anonymous. He'd started volunteering at a youth center in the Bronx, teaching business skills to kids who'd never had advantages. Maybe humiliation was the only teacher cruel enough to reach him. Maybe losing everything was the only way he'd learn what mattered. Or maybe he'd never learn. Either way, it wasn't her problem anymore. She'd taken his throne not because she wanted it, but because someone had to. And it might as well be someone who remembered what it felt like to be powerless. Some stories end with dramatic declarations of love or revenge. This one ends with something rare. A reminder that your treatment of those who can do nothing for you is the ultimate measure of your worth. Sterling Thorne learned that the most expensive thing you can lose isn't money. It's your humanity. And Nia Hayes learned that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change not just one life, but an entire empire. The baby in that restaurant had cried for 60 seconds, but those 60 seconds had rewritten the future. And somewhere in New York, in hospitals and offices and diners and boardrooms, people were living in the world that Crying Baby had created. A world where character mattered, where kindness counted, where the right thing and the smart thing were finally, miraculously, the same thing. So what did you think? Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments, and tell us, do you believe character is the ultimate currency? Hit subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world. God bless you.